All right, everybody, we are here for another edition of Lawyer Radio. This is going to be part 2 of our 3-part series about step-parenting relationships. And joining us today is Maria Natapov. She is the founder and head coach of Synergistic Step Parenting. She helps divorced parents and step-parents transform family chaos into meaningful and harmonious co-parenting. So thank you for joining us again today, Maria. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
It's such a pleasure to be here again, Christina. Thank you so much for having me back for this conversation.
Of course. I think it's a really important one. Of course, I, as a divorce lawyer, see people all the time as they're exiting a relationship, and that can be hard enough. That's such a huge transition for an entire family. But then when you start to introduce new people into the relationship, it can be a challenge, to put it mildly. But one thing I wanted to emphasize with this 3-part series is that there are different perspectives. So everybody isn't having the exact same experience. And on the last show, we explored one perspective. We made up a hypothetical family. Mom and dad had been divorced. I don't remember we said how long, but they were divorced, and they have a 10-year-old, and dad was now in a new relationship. And we talked about his considerations, balancing his need to move on with his life and have love in his life again, but also to be mindful of the kind of experience that his child is having. And we focused largely on him. And just so anybody watching, we did not forget about the child. There is a 4th perspective, but we feel that all of these conversations are always focused on what we can do to further the best interests of the child in these situations. So they are, throughout. But today we're going to focus on the stepmom. So what is she thinking? What's fair for her? Are there rules? How best can the stepmom navigate this kind of situation? So. Yeah. So thank you. I know you see this all the time. You see this definitely closer up than I do, because you see them after the divorce when they're, really going back to living their lives and maybe even starting to establish a new normal for the family. So what are the things that you see come up again and again with, we'll say in this case, the stepmom?
Yeah. Well, there's questions and reservations about, like, how do I meet the stepchild, right? How and when and what do I do? And so those are really common questions. And I think some of the main challenges also are, this isn't one that's necessarily easily identified, because kids in general, as we've mentioned before, they tend to put on a brave face. They feel like they're often on the chopping block, so they don't want to cause any waves because they don't want to potentially be replaced, right? Like, they're scared that they may lose the love of mom or dad, or they don't want to disappoint them, or they just don't want to burden them. And with this new person coming in, they may have all kinds of emotions because it's confusing and they're not quite sure, who is this person? What role are they going to play? And so that tends to cause a lot of fear. Sometimes what I call behaviors coming out sideways, right? When kids don't have the ability to identify their emotions and speak about them, they might come out another way, their frustration or their fear or their anger and really resentment potentially. So I think for the new coming step parent, they don't know the child as well as their parents do. They don't have the rapport established. So it's a little extra, it's extra challenging for them to get a finger on the beat, right? Is this the norm, or is this behavior and interactions and the dynamic that I'm seeing because of me being the new change, me essentially ushering in this new change just by my sheer presence, right? And this sheer relationship that the child is being exposed to, or perhaps is learning about. So I think that is a challenge. And then beyond that, what I often hear is step parents feel like they don't have a voice. They often can feel like they're an outsider, and that even if, they are cohabitating, that they don't feel that their place is their place. And even if in situations where their partner and the children are moving into their own apartment or home, sometimes they still feel like it's not their home, like their home has been hijacked and they're a guest in their own home and they can't find their own place. So that's, of course, very difficult. And as you can imagine, is very grating and takes a huge toll, because our home is supposed to be our sanctuary. So when we're feeling ill at ease and are constantly having to either walk on eggshells, or I've even heard from people that they sometimes work extra hours or find other things to do because they don't want to be home as often, that naturally poses a challenge. And then from the perspective of conflict resolution with these scenarios, the more we avoid, right? And we're avoiding because it's like we've tried everything we know to do and we don't know what we don't know. So those ideas, those skills are not just going to magically appear in our mind. And so we start to avoid and kind of escape the situation. And the challenge there is then nothing is moving forward. And it can also kind of build up the feelings of hopelessness and sort of just feel like there's really nothing that can be done. And that's devastating.
I would imagine that is really important for the couple, like dad and the new woman in his life, to have a lot of conversations about what their expectations are before the child is even introduced into the situation. I've seen over the years, just with friends, acquaintances, in my own personal life, people that are rather casual about introducing the kids, almost like you're introducing, the same way that you might introduce your friends. I mean, I think that's different, because if I meet my friend's new boyfriend, I mean, it doesn't affect my life in any way, really. I mean, not profoundly. Even if I don't like the guy, I don't have to live with him. He's not part of my family. I just maybe have to accept him as my friend's new love interest. But I don't think that people should be so casual about introducing their children to somebody, because it's such a profound relationship that you have to give it much more intention. And so, do you see that? Do you see people be rather casual about it?
I think sometimes, and I think it's okay to be, but I agree that ideally it's not ideal to introduce those individuals to the child until it really feels quite serious and you've sort of, really intentionally thought through and discussed, or at least evaluated for yourself. Is there alignment here? Do I see a future with this person? And I know we've spoken about this before, Christina. It's so important to consider the child's needs in this equation. Yes, it's important to consider your needs as well. But additionally, kids are not asking for this. It is a huge load on them just to go through the divorce in and of itself. They take much longer than adults do to recover from that process. And it has a longer lasting impact on them because they are still developing. Even for what we consider to be adult children who are 18 years old and older, our brain doesn't completely form until our late 20s, and in many cases until our early, maybe even mid 30s. So as much as they're legally an adult, they don't necessarily have the full capacity to completely process the entire situation. And even for adult children who are actual adults with a fully developed brain, this divorce still takes a huge toll on how they understand their entire childhood, their entire security and foundation for what they've known to be a family. And it often impacts them in their own personal relationships and romantic relationships as well. So really, it's quite important to be intentional, as you've mentioned, Christina, when introducing a new partner, because it messes with the kid's sense of security. If there's a lot of transient people coming in and they can't help but often form some sort of an attachment to that individual. So it really is best that if this is just a casual person you're dating, enjoy yourself, but don't necessarily involve your children in those dates, those interactions, until you are pretty sure that this is going to last and that it's going to really take your kids into consideration and be in alignment with the kind of support and environment that they are needing And then it's best to move forward. But I also know that realistically, even in spite of our best intentions, things happen sometimes. Sometimes we're not intending for our child to meet the partner, but it does happen unexpectedly with different circumstances. So I still think, I know I've mentioned this before, it's really important to have conversations with your children and involve them in the discussion in an open way where they feel comfortable sharing how they really feel and they know that their feelings are welcome and respected without feeling pressure to change their mind or give a particular answer or feeling judged.
Well, those are really important points. And again, I want to emphasize that all of this is always for the best interest of the child, which hopefully in every situation is the primary concern. But today I want to focus more on the stepmom and her experience when she's coming into this new situation. And I think I would imagine it's different because I was in a situation like that a long, long time ago. I dated somebody that had a child and I was young. I was in my early 30s and hadn't really spent a lot of time around little kids. And this child was 2. And, we did everything wrong, but that relationship didn't last very long. So we did everything wrong. But just over time, it was very much a learning experience for me because I realized, I think it's different when you do not have your own children and you go into a relationship where someone has children. I think that experience is very different than for a stepmom who does have her own children. So she's also bringing into the relationship her own children. So she knows what it's like to be a mom. She has those, if people want to call it maternal instincts. I remember one of the things that was troubling for me is I was expected to have these maternal instincts for a child that wasn't mine. And I have heard similar kinds of complaints from other people that are in relationships like that when they don't have children. So do you encounter a lot of people like that? And how do you help them navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it requires perspective taking, right? And as you said, it doesn't necessarily, it's sort of an acquired skill. I think that there's a couple of other factors that also play a role. So for example, sometimes whether or not the person has had children, maybe they've been around children a lot. Maybe they work in, some sort of an environment where they've had to do caregiving to children. Perhaps they grew up with having younger siblings. Or there's just children in their family, right? So I think some of those pieces also play a role in some of this as well. But I agree, that certainly that has an impact. I think that sometimes when people have their own kids, that can also create other challenges because then it becomes, well, how are my kids being prioritized compared to these other kids? Does it really feel even? Are their needs being met? Sometimes those needs are different. Sometimes it has to do with the kids aren't getting along with each other, or there's certain dynamics that are at play between the kids. And then that becomes an additional layer for the parents to navigate. And that can cause significant turbulence, if you will, in that relationship and family dynamic. So I think there's multiple layers to this consideration. But I agree that, certainly if one is coming from a life where they haven't really had to consider little kids and those kinds of needs and those kinds of activities, even structures and routines, right? As adults, our time is ours. And so if that isn't something we've had to consider, or at least had to consider for a while, that will be an adjustment for sure. And I completely agree with you when you say, I believe it was, you said this a little bit ago, that it's important to consider like how is this going to work? What are the expectations? And having those conversations between the partners. Where do you see yourself? What do you see your role being? What do you see yourself being able to contribute to? And what is there for you to be able to contribute to? Because maybe you want to, but that's not something that is available just because of the co-parenting relationship that the biological parents have. So every situation is unique. And those are some of the most important conversations from a foundational perspective.
Well,
Because
what are specifically some of the things they should talk about? Some things that come to my mind are, what kind of routine you want in the household.
yes,
Um, whose responsibility is it to discipline the child,
yeah,
and what does that look like?
yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I
I
don't know
think
where we are on spanking. I think that's a big no-no, but I mean,
that
there's people that do it.
there are
Um,
people who do it. That's true, unfortunately.
is there timeout? Does
Yeah.
stepmom have authority to take the iPad away?
Yeah.
What does stepmom have authority to do?
Yeah.
Where would she be overstepping boundaries? I think those are a lot of the things that, I see. And you said something really astute earlier. You said that women can feel, or the other step parent can feel sort of like their house has been hijacked.
Mhm.
Because that is something that I've observed, and it's interesting because they are trying so hard to be liked. They want to be liked by the children.
Yeah.
They don't want to be the one responsible for causing any kind of
Conflict.
stress on the child. But then at the same time, how do they balance not having their entire lives upended? Like,
Yeah.
how do they balance making a home for themselves, because it is their home,
Yes,
right? It's their
100%.
home too.
Yeah.
um so I mean, do you see that all the time? What do you specifically tell people to do? I mean, how do you walk through that with people?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you mentioned. Some of it is really valuable to discover and then create alignment with the partner about and have conversations to find some sort of a middle ground that they both can agree to. Some of it also comes down to just simply best practices to not create conflict. So I'll start with one fundamental component, which is that it's really for the step parent having to do with the children, it's connection over consequences. I strongly advise that people do not step into a disciplinary role pretty much ever. It's possible to eventually grow into that relationship with the child if you come in when they're really young. However, it's still possible that that won't be available. And sometimes, even when things seem to be going in a great trajectory, once they hit their teenage years, things can shift and change. And there's many factors contributing to that. That's when kids are starting to process more. It also could depend on what is the relationship like with the other bio parent. Maybe they weren't in their lives and now they are more in their lives, or they just have more awareness around that situation. So there's a lot of different factors that play a role in the ability to have that type of a relationship where the step parent would be welcome to, and it would be safe for them to implement some disciplining, and that the child would respond to it in a way where they're able to receive that without it causing friction, tension, resentment, etc., a rift, essentially. Additionally, when it comes to, as you were saying, how to navigate, creating space for themselves, but also creating an environment that is conducive to the child's needs and really considering that. So you're right. Some factors to look at are, how do you want your house to be kept, right? Like, what's really important to you? And there may need to be some compromise, right? If you're somebody who's extremely clean, and you want everything to be in its proper place all the time, that's how I grew up. That may not be available if you have little kids, or maybe even just tweens and teens. And it's not because they're trying to make your life miserable and like they should know better. They're this age. Kids have a lot going on, and there's a whole emotional world and landscape they're navigating. And even if they look like they're perfectly fine from the outside, they may not be. And so if they're not able to maintain the level of order and cleanliness that you are expecting, it's not that they're trying to be rebellious or they're just spoiled. It's really a sign that they're navigating some other challenges from an emotional standpoint. And so they need some more support and some more grace and some more guidance. It doesn't mean you just throw your hands up and necessarily let them do whatever they want, but having that compassion and understanding, and recognizing that kids are in different places. So just because I think we often have this standard, we want to put everybody in a bucket and say, well, they're this age, they should be able to do this. But in reality, it's not quite so cut and dry. There's, again, many factors. We're also wired differently. So there could be other contributing things that are going on for them as to why they may not quite yet have that level of skill that you're expecting. So I think having those conversations is important, but with compassion and really letting the biological parent guide those conversations, initiate those conversations. They really should be had with the biological parent one-on-one. And then possibly, if it makes sense, if there's room and the relationship has been established enough to where you guys have joint family meetings, that could then be part of the conversation where the step parent is contributing as well with the rest of the children and family that lives on those premises. That is a great way to allow everybody to be heard and be represented in the conversation. And really starting to consider, okay, well, I have these needs, but this other individual has these needs. How can we come together to find a middle ground or start moving things in a particular direction that feels okay and comforting for all of us? Can we get creative with some of the problem solving? And kids are phenomenal problem solvers. We don't give them enough credit. We often think they're too young, they won't know, how can they possibly contribute? You'd be surprised if you allow them to participate in those conversations, how much they can bring to the table, and they're extremely clever at coming up with creative ways to problem solve. And it's a great life skill as well. So that would be my suggestion on that. But it is really important for everybody to really assess, as you were saying, Christina, what can they live with? That's really the place to start. That's what I often advise my clients is, what are your values, but also what's really important to you? What is kind of a non-negotiable? And if you know about that about yourself, then having that conversation with your partner and exploring that and saying, can your kids live with this? Can you live with this? Will this work out? Because maybe if it's too inflexible and there's too many differences, maybe it's not the right fit.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part for people is recognizing when something's just not a good fit. Yeah. Although, one of the interesting things is that, especially if you don't have children, but actually, regardless of whether you have your own children, you get to see what the other person's parenting style is.
Yes.
When you're a couple just starting out your relationship and you don't have children yet, you don't really know what kind of parent that other person will be. Yeah. But you get to see what kind of parent they are.
Absolutely. And I think actually that's a really key point that I was going to get to next. The other major piece that people tend to disagree on is parenting styles. So having those conversations is really key. And a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes it's tempting when, for example, a man is recoupling and that person comes in and they have some really great ideas and they have wonderful things to contribute as far as what they're observing. They bring in a third-party perspective. They haven't grown up with these children, so they may have a more, current, unattached view of the actual reality of the situation. Sometimes parents can have a little bit of like a filter over their eyes when it comes to viewing their children, because they know their children's heart and they've seen this child grow up, from being tiny all the way to whatever age they currently are. So they might be looking at them in a different way than, for example, an incoming step parent. So while that's a really valuable perspective, the reality is that they're navigating all of that can be quite complicated, because essentially the step parent is having to, sorry, I apologize. I totally forgot what I was somewhere. I just blanked out. I'm bad. I'm sorry.
It's okay. We all do it.
Sorry. Can you just jog my memory, please? Oh my goodness.
I think anybody can relate to this because we've all had these days. It feels like it should be Monday, but it's actually
Tuesday.
Well, we're actually recording this, even though it's a live stream. We're actually recording this to go live on Friday. But it's one of those weeks where it just feels like it's been Monday every day.
Mhm.
So I think there's been a lot of weeks like that. I think everybody was saying January was like 60 days long.
Thank you. Sorry, I remember where we were now. We were talking about parenting styles. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. So as I was saying, even though the step parent can bring in this really valuable neutral perspective that might be needed and can provide value in a more perhaps objective way with where things are at now, or at least how things appear from the outside, right? So from the outside of the parent who is attached to these kids and has known them their whole life. Nonetheless, it's really valuable to have the parent really kind of navigating the conversations with the child, but it is really important for the step parent and the parent to discuss what are the expectations for the kids. Because again, that could be another potential deal breaker, right? If there's too many differences and it's not just the differences, because it's possible that there are differences, but people are open and they're open to feedback and they're open to kind of growing and exploring and perhaps, again, finding a bit of a middle ground or trying something new. So in that case, there could be workability. If you have people who are just dead set in their ways and they're absolutely not interested in exploring anything new, acquiring new information, trying different things that might work better, then again, it's really valuable to consider, is this going to work in the long term? Because even among married parents who have no intention of getting divorced, when it comes to disciplining children, if they have very different views, that causes a lot of tension and eventually may lead to divorce and often does. So now you have an even more, I would say, severe situation, only to say that you're not a biological parent to these children. So in a sense, that creates an imbalance because you may have less say. And so it's really important to have those conversations early on to see, is there alignment in how we look at things? What would be our plan? How would we navigate differences? Are we open to exploring and receiving new information that might help us make better decisions when it comes to this, so that it's not just, he said, she said kind of a scenario where they just get into a tug of war and a battle and they lock heads. So yeah, those would be some of the key.
What about the stepmom spending time with the child? Like, should they be concerned about bonding with each other? Or, I've seen relationships where the step parent, gets along with the kid, but they're not close, like they don't have a special bond. Like, it's almost like they just tolerate each other because they have to.
Yeah.
And then you see situations where they have a mutual love and respect for each other and they have a good relationship.
Yeah. Sometimes that depends on personalities. Again, it often depends on what's available based on circumstances. But I do think, and this is sort of what I was trying to, I think, point to, so I'll echo it in this conversation when it comes to, yes, the step parent and the child. Ideally, the step parent, being the adult coming into the situation, would look for openings to build rapport, right? To get interested in something that the child is already doing or already interested in, and looking for ways to either be a part of that or at least initiate conversations around those topics. One thing I will say, though, is that the parent has a pretty key role in all of this because they're the glue. They're the intermediate person. They're kind of the link between all of these individuals. So that is to say that it's really important that they're kind of facilitating that relationship and that dynamic, and are helping both the step parent and the child to navigate building that rapport, building that connection. And that includes individual conversations with the children where they can really get a true beat on where's the child at, how is this feeling for them, how is it going for them, as well as with the step parent, that they both require quite a lot of support. It can be really difficult. It can feel a lot like rejection if they're not able to bond with the child right away. That's not the case. It's not personal. But for the step parent, it can feel really painful and kind of devastating, especially when the parent and child already have this amazing bond and they're just feeling completely on the outs and like they're a third wheel. So they do require some support, not more than the child, not prioritizing over the child. But yeah, both do require that assistance from the parent who knows both parties, knows the heart, hopefully, of both parties, and can support both of these individuals to maybe have more successful outcomes, and just kind of cueing them in on, hey, this is an important thing to remember about so and so, or this is what little Billy likes to do, so maybe you can talk to him about some of these things, and that could be a way in. Right, so kind of helping them.
So basically the common thread from this week and last week, and pretty much every conversation I've ever had with any kind of coach or, psychologist or someone in that kind of setting, is communication, people.
Yes, communication is king and key.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, I always communication. I just want to beat people over the head with that. You have to talk. You have to have the hard conversations.
Yes.
Don't avoid them.
When it comes to creating the rapport with the child for the step parent, you don't necessarily always have to talk, right? Kids, that can be overwhelming for them. It can feel uncomfortable. They might not know what to say. But if you have an opportunity to just sit side by side, a lot of times kids can feel intimidated by direct eye contact across from each other, which is why sometimes like a family dinner can be quite intense and a little too much. But if you have an opportunity, I don't know, maybe to sit side by side on a couch, or perhaps, in the car or something like that, that could be a great time. And it removes the immediate kind of intensity of having to look at each other. But perhaps, if they're watching a show, you can, sit next to them and you watch for a little while, and you can ask a question perhaps, or just simply being next to them if they're okay with it. That might be okay, because, right, there's such a thing, like kids are sensing energy. So if your energy is calm and it's inviting and it's relaxed and you're easy to be around, that can be also a really beautiful way to start building comfortability, a rapport, just being around each other and getting used to that in and of itself. So there's many different ends and ways to do it. I would say definitely don't push, don't put pressure, and find what's comfortable and find what works and feel it out, and have a lot of grace with yourself, because it can take time and it's not personal.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as you were speaking is, we have to, whatever angle you're looking at this from, we do have to be patient with kids. Like you've mentioned, their brains are not fully developed. They're still developing. And especially if you're lucky enough to have a preteen or a teenager who's going through puberty, they have all kinds of hormones fluctuating, and they're not always predictable. They don't always make sense. They seem emotional, moody, but just try to remember, probably 90% of the time, it's not really about you.
Yes.
It's just, I think kids are, around that age are more focused on, what's going on at school and, whether so-and-so likes them. So I think a lot of their stress comes from that. Their focus seems to be on that. I have an 11-year-old goddaughter, and that's pretty much where her head is right now.
Totally. I could have gotten a weird look from somebody that they don't know or do know in the hallway, and years ago, and there's still all kinds of in their head about it.
I still do that, Maria.
Right? I know, it's part of being a human, but like for kids, like you said, their world, they're used to thinking from their own perspective. So when they're not thinking from their own perspective, it's usually a survival instinct, which is again why we say, if they're worried, if they're getting signs of like, well, if dad was replaceable or mom was replaceable, maybe I am too. Like that's a different kind of thing. That's not them being calm and free and secure to express themselves. So actually, again, a little bit more support is often needed in those times, but it also could just be, like we just said, totally unrelated to the divorce and the blended family situation. It could just be something that happened in school and processing.
Because they're a kid, just because they're a kid.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, there's so many other things that we could talk about. This conversation was not meant to be exhaustive about the stepmom experience.
Right.
You know, there's just so many things that we could have talked about, but I hope that people got something out of this. And again, just really communicate with your partner about what you expect of each other, about what you want, and figure it out. You know, it's an evolution. It's going to take time. It's not like you're going to have one conversation and you're going to have it all figured out.
Right. And don't hand off, as much as it could be tempting, because the step parent is, maybe they're really good at organizing or they're really good at certain things, and it's tempting to hand off disciplining or creating the structure and routine to them as the primary person. And I strongly encourage you not to do that, because it's not going to feel good to your kids. And that's how oftentimes the rifts come up and their resentment builds. So while they can possibly be involved, while they can maybe support you behind closed doors with some of that logistical stuff and thinking through it and organizing it, please don't hand that off to another individual. Please do have the primary role with your children, especially as they're just getting used to this new dynamic post-divorce.
All right. Well, thank you. I strongly recommend that anybody who is going through this challenge right now, if they need some help, that they reach out to you. Clearly, you have your finger on the pulse. And they can find you at synergisticstepparenting.com. We will also put that in the show notes, and I'll put the link in the comments. But thank you. And join us next week, every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll have you for the final episode of the 3-part series, where we will talk about mom, the biological mom, and her perspective in all of this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Have a great week, everybody.